G'day Scott. I'll just give you a look from what you last saw when you were here. There's the 35 litre tank. It's off the bike. I'll just traverse down from front to rear, and what we have here is over there. You can see, I'll just zoom in for you. That's the final drive. That's the final drive that's out of the bike. All the swing arm pivot bearings, both left hand side and right hand side, they'll be looked at. And over there we have no gearbox. The gearbox is out of the bike. As you can see, there's the flywheel pressure plate and clutch plate there. So yeah, I'm getting in, replacing pinion pivot bearings, which is that one there on the end of that. Lucky I've got in when I did. What I've got here on the input shaft of the input side of the gearbox. Don't know if you can see those splines. Not much. Yeah, but they were very dry. And there's also an oil seal in there. To get rid of that torch, it's probably creating a depth of field problem. But they were dry. The spline shafts on that gearbox were dry, so I just got in there at the right time. Teeth are okay, no distortion there or no curving of teeth. That seal, you can see it. It's been weeping from the bottom there down to there, but only just weeping, so it keeps the case wet. It's not as if it leaked profusely and contaminated the clutch plate. So very fortunate there. Over here, they've got the final drive out. These are what they call pinion pivot bearings. They have a habit of flogging out, so I've got new ones of those. I'm doing away with the needle rollers and putting bushes in there. Ones where I don't have to pull the final drive off the, release the final drive from the paralever, and it will have grease nipples attached where I can actually grease those whilst that final drive is in situ. So there you have it. Take care and all the best. Now, this is what you will need for the pinion input seal. I call it a castle ring, which I showed you earlier on. It's got parapets in there like a castle, okay? I think they call them parapets. Looks like a castle, right? Now that's the tool that fits in to that ring. So that's been loosely placed in there with a new seal. The slip ring that goes over the spline where the lip of the lip seal comes into contact with has yet to be placed in there. So this needs to be heated to 100 degrees Celsius before you torque down that ring, castle ring, input pivot on the final drive. Before you torque down that castle ring, you need to coat it, the threads, with BMW suggested Hylamar, but I've put Loctite RTV silicon gasket maker. It doesn't set hard. It remains, yes, okay, it doesn't set hard, but BMW suggested Hylamar. This is the modern day equivalent to that. So just give the threads a light coat of that. Then torque it down with this special tool. So that nut on the end of that, you've also got a Tommy bar that can slip through there. Use that, but I prefer putting a 36mm socket on there, because that nut that you first take off to get to the castle ring, that nut is also 36mm, and this nut here on this special tool is also 36mm. So those 4 points slip in to those 4 points there that you can see on the castle ring. The castle ring, of course, like I said, contains the lip seal. That slips in there like that. You'll feel it lock in. Then you put your torque wrench on there whilst it's hot. Don't forget, 100 degrees Celsius. Then screw it down and torque it down to 118 Newton meters, 118 Newton meters. So before this ring is removed, this castle ring, before that's removed from in there, you need to heat this housing. You can sort of see a distinct line here. Well, that's pretty well, and another thick band. Well, that's pretty well where that ring sits in set. So it needs to be heated. This housing, pinion housing, final drive pinion, input pinion, it needs to be heated to 100 degrees Celsius. 100 degrees Celsius using one of these little gas, trade map gas, LPG, liquid propane gas, right? Commonly available at any hardware store. So you need to heat here, all around, up the top, on the other side. Just keep on waving around and keep the blue tip, the light blue tip, close to there, because that's where most heat is generated from the flame. So heat that to 100 degrees Celsius before you even attempt. And what I do is I take it up to 105, 106 degrees Celsius, because by the time you turn your torch off, set your socket up with the extension bar, it's cooled down to where you need it to be, 100. If you take it up to 100, turn the torch off, and by the time you set up your socket and extension bar, it's probably cooled down to 94. So take it up to 105. Now this nut here is the one you have to remove. From the pinion input shaft spline. Okay, so that's the first one that needs to be removed before you even get to this castle ring. Okay, so this nut here in there has to be heated to 105 degrees Celsius before it even looks like being released. Don't attempt it cold, because you'll distort everything in and around here that's being held before that even looks like snapping free. All right. Here we have the paralever final drive. Okay, not the mono lever final drive. It's quite distinctly different. This is the paralever final drive, and here we have what would be called a castle ring. Now, that castle ring, I don't know if you can see it up in there. I'll try and zoom in up into there. you can't, it's not allowing us to see the threads in detail. Okay, I'll try another, but I'll put my finger all the way in there. There you are, you can just see the threads. My finger is pointing to them. Okay, I'm touching them there, right down there, in there. That's the threads that slips into that. That screws down into there. And this here is the infamous seal, problematic seal that needs to put in correctly, because that lip there wears out after a while, and it actually seals, that seal there actually seals up against a little steel ring. Okay, now have a look at this one here. You can see the corrosion where my fingernail is. That bike has sat for quite some time. Now this here, this shiny bit here, where my fingernail is moving on, that's the path that the lip seal actually travels on. Now this, I can feel it, is very, very rough. It's no longer smooth like the outer edge here where the fingernail is. No longer smooth at all. Okay, now that's very abrasive. So what that's done is that's actually worn the lip seal and caused it to leak. But the bike, and you can see with that rust there that my fingernail is now on, that rust there, that bike has sat for quite some time. Moisture has built up and it's actually pooled. You can actually see the rust where the bike has sat, the moisture building up down in there. You can actually see rust forming in and around the outer diameter of that seal. But the old saying is, if you don't use it, you'll lose it. And when these seals sit, as this bike I suspect had done for 4, 5, even 8 years in one spot, when they sit, they dry out here, and as soon as that staff starts to turn after prolonged sitting, it tears the lip. It puts little tears in there, and those little tears represent oil ways in which the oil can leak out from the final drive down into the boot. The telltale sign is you peel the boot back, the boot coupling if you like, or the pinion, pivot, bearing rubber boot. You peel that boot back. If you've got oil coming down there, it could either imply that this seal has gone, more than likely, or the output shaft seal right up the top, and it runs down the full length of the drive shaft tunnel and leaks out that boot. Now, that's the old seal there. That gets taken out and a new seal goes into its place. Just a little bit of light grease in and around that surface there. And replace this ring. Do not, see, that's all abrasive there. If you put that back in, it will just tear your new seal and render it useless like the one you're replacing. So do not put that old ring back in situ. You can see the abrasiveness there. Very, very rough. So do not put that old ring back in. Replace it with a new one. Okay, so once we've torqued that down to 118 Newton meters, of course, your seal, lip seal, is in situ, as explained before, we now progress to the next step, which is, as you can see, there's a new ring and an old ring. Look at the rust that's formed on the outer edge. That abrasive section there that's fairly scuffed, all of about 3 mil in width, that little band that you see next to the rust band, heading towards the new ring. Look at that. It's just been eaten up. It's actually abrasive. It's no longer smooth. And what that's done is torn minor little tears that you can see under a microscope on the old lip seal. So there's no longer a seal there. It's been compromised. The lip on the lip seal has been compromised, and the little tears allow oil ways to pass out of the final drive and into the pinion pivot area, well past the input of the final drive. And where does it collect? Let me tell you, it collects here. Down in there. In those little pleats on that rubber boot. That rubber boot in the vicinity of the pinion pivot needle bearings. So it leaks out of the input on the pinion side of the final drive down into there. And also, if you've got an output shaft seal right up there from the gearbox, it'll run out of there, down the tunnel, and collect into there also. We'll get onto that. Now, before we slip that in, this new ring, see, it's a much better surface. Lip on the new oil seal will be very happy coming into contact with that nice, smooth. So we'll put a little bit of, I've already greased the lip on that lip seal, but here I will also put a little bit of grease on that. So those two surfaces, the lip on the oil surface and this, just slide in and create a nice seal. So there's that ring, the steel ring that I just greased. Now if you're going to push that on, you do so very, very gently. And what I use is 2 Magnum sticks, okay? Connoisseur, very fine brand, nice chocolate Magnum, vanilla ice cream underneath. But I get those in there and I push that in, and you'll feel it meet the lip of the seal, and it will stop at a certain point halfway across the outer diameter surface width. Now we're coming to the stage where we will torque up the final drive input nut pinion fastener. Okay, the final drive pinion input hex head nut fastener, and it will be torqued at an extremely high Newton meter, 150 Newton meters to 165. Now that's a lot of torque, and you will need to put Loctite, high strength Loctite on the threads of that pinion final drive input, pinion input nut fastener. You need to put Loctite on those threads. Now the other thing is, most importantly, here, This is a 36 mil long reach. There's my thumb. From where it grabs the nut all the way down to there. You will need a long reach 36 mil socket to do the task. And the other thing, to get adequate purchase swing, is you really need a long, elongated, right, kid you not, a long, elongated torque wrench, so you can get that swing and purchase to get up to that torque that you need, up to that 150 to 165 Newton meter torque that you need. Don't forget to clean up the threads on that pinion nut fastener. Get rid of the old Loctite before you start. Okay, that little ring, I'll point it out to you. I'll use this brass. Just see it there. It meets the outer diameter of the spline shaft, but that's the ring there. And then up here, that black band is the lip seal. Now sometimes they can be a bit firm, so I suggest that using a brass punch, okay, and a half-pound hammer, just gently tap around the outskirts of that rim, and you'll feel it expand the lip. After you've greased that ring, that is, you'll feel it expand the lip of the lip seal and make its way in, and you'll feel it bottom out. And it needs to bottom out because there's another little seal around that spline shaft inset behind the castle ring. But anyway, once we put some Loctite on our nut, I don't know where it's gone, just bear with me. Must be behind here. There it is there. Once we fit that 36 mil nut, that will push that little sleeve all the way home up against the other seal, creating an all-round seal, a oil leak proof seal. All right, now just preparing for this hex head nut to go on. If you can just see in there, see between those threads, still got a bit of the Loctite, so we need to clean up those threads so as we get the correct torque when we're torquing it up. If we don't clean them up, all that content in that pitch between the threads, that will cause binding. And it might bind up well before it seats properly up against that little sleeve. That might bind up well above its torque value. So just clean those threads up before it goes on. All right, so the Loctite I use on final drives, pinion pivot bolts, and all else is Loctite 270. You can see the hieroglyphics down there. It's not, well, last time I purchased this, it wasn't available in Aust, and I had to procure it. I had to get it from overseas. Anyway, Loctite 270, especially for an application like this, the pinion input nut fastener on your paralever final drives. Now, see around the outskirts of that castle screw ring where the oil seal was fitted, look at the blue RTV gasket maker. Remember that application? We put it into the threads. See the blue? It's all the way around. It's just mushroomed out, squished out from those threads. And see how it, you can see the blue all the way around. So that tells you you've got a good all-round seal in that thread pitch of the castle screw ring. And you know there's no oil that's going to get past those threads. Even, yeah, so that's just another check. Very important to put that blue RTV gasket maker or black RTV gasket maker that does not set in concrete, that does not set firm, but still maintains its elasticity. That's what you're chasing. Okay, so that nut now with the Loctite application has been torqued to 160 Newton meters. They say 150 to 165 Newton meters. I've picked 160. Is that Loctite up there? It's probably the best you're going to get. It'll keep it in situ at 160 Nm. So there you have it. It's just been torqued to 160 Newton meters. Give you a little bit of a look-see in there. It can be hard. But, yeah, so there you have it. So that's a new input pinion seal that's been replaced. It's quite complex. If you've done it 2 or 3 times and you do it regularly, of course you'll be a bit better at it, but first time applications can be a bit testing. Now that we've got that complex part of the house in order, we've got another house check, and that's these little needle pinion pivot rollers. When I turn those, they're all notchy. See, these things are designed, these needle rollers are designed to rotate 360 degrees. That's their purpose. But here on this application, on the pinion pivot pins, all they do is rotate about that much. Depending on the bump that you hit and depending on how far that shock's compressed and how far they travel, it might be about that much. Most of the time, with irregularities, it's about that. So what you have is you have a process called Brenelling, where those little needle rollers, because of the limited movement, actually carve impressions into the outer race. And this is why it becomes all notchy. And eventually it gets rid of all the case hardening on the rollers and case hardening on the races themselves, and that there collapses. When it collapses, it's not a very pretty scene, especially between two horse towns. You ain't going nowhere. So stay tuned with the next video and we'll get on to replacing these. Very important. Now, before you move on, after this step, in there's splines. That's the spline shaft. Here, what we have, I've cut those bristles back, and I've cut them back because as you cut them back about half the width, can't get a good dimensional sense here, they become more tense. They don't flex as much the closer they get to the root. And that's good for actually getting in there and putting in your spline grease. You've got to use the correct spline grease. Now the spline grease we use is that one there. Mollib Alloy. Mollib Alloy. Paste White Tea. Castrol. That's the one BMW recommend. Okay, that's for your spline shafts. That's out of Munich motorcycles, a bit like that optimal paste that they refer to, the white paste. There it is. Okay, so we don't put a lot on, but we just put it on sparingly. You can see that application there going on. Very important that he gets a good feed of that grease. So don't put an excessive amount. This little brush with its hairs, or bristles if you like, cut back about half the length is ideal. It gets right down in between the pitch of those splines. Those splines are like an Acme thread, really thick, not sharp on top but flat for maximum load. Multiple of them, of course, there to handle the load. So got the gist of how it's done. There you go. Okay, so we've applied that. So what you do is you have a look, especially right down in between the threads, all the way down. Make sure that we have that coverage. There you go, that's all you need. Don't need a whole heap. Okay, there we go. Spline greased. New oil seal on the final drive input pinion. Now just further on the gearbox, you will be able to visualise, and you'll see a certain amount of wet. So this is the top of the gearbox here. That's the top of the gearbox where you have these two distinct lugs. Okay. So this was actually weeping. You can see how wet it is around that seal. It was weeping. It wasn't leaking. There were no drips as such, but it was slowly weeping down here. And as it weeped, it didn't fling off. It just adhered to the gearbox casing, and it had a distinct formation. Remember now that that's the top of the gearbox. So gravity had it that it had a 45-degree formation where it was wet from weeping. As you can imagine, in here you've got the clutch assembly spinning around, but there was no oil that actually dripped. It was just a very adhesive weep that stuck to this gearbox casing. But anyway, look, I suggest that even if the seal looks reasonably well, even if you have no wet or weep or leak or drip. I suggest you replace this gearbox input shaft seal whilst opportunity presents. So that's what I'm about to undertake here. I'll be replacing that, and then I also found that I had a bit of a leak on the gearbox output shaft. Okay, so that's there, the gearbox output shaft. It was also weeping. So I'm just waiting on a puller. There's a special puller where I'll undo this, lock the gearbox, and undo this retaining nut, take the coupling, drive shaft coupling or gearbox output coupling if you like, take that off, then I'll replace that seal underneath there, which I'll show you in video coverage also. Now this kit here actually comes from Munich Motorcycles. You can actually see the brass stemmed grease nipples there. What they actually do is you remove that little Allen key. I've only got one hand here, so I'll do my best. You remove that Allen key there, and then you screw in these and you grease them. Just give them a quick flick every 10,000 Ks. That saves having to dismantle that, separate it from the bike to access the area that you need. You're already lubricating it here. It saves time, it saves disassembly, and it's really a headache-free process. But every 50,000 kilometres, I'd say 45 to 50, that paralever has to come off. It has to come off to inspect the output shaft on the gearbox for leaks, and it has to come off to separate. You separate the final drive, then the drive line, swing arm area, and then you take the gearbox out to lubricate the gearbox input splines. So, realistically, every 45,000 or 50,000, you really got to get in there and pull all these components apart anyway. But at least you can get here and lubricate these every 10,000 kilometres. One or two flicks of the grease gun, one or two primes, and that's all you need. Fairly good value too. Now this application here, these are the original ones, but you can start to see the Brinelling there. They call it Brinelling. It's where those needle rollers, see the needle rollers inside there? This was designed to rotate at speed at 360 degrees, complete revolutions. But on this application here, on the pinion pivot bearings, they're rocking like that. They only rotate about 15 degrees, if that, maybe 20 or 25 if you hit a larger bump and it forces the rear wheel up. But you get this rocking motion. And what happens is, with that rocking motion, is it starts to make impressions on the race, and they wear out. They wear out quite quickly, actually. So I've decided to forego that and opt for bushes. Now, after having replaced that pinion input final drive seal, you can see we've also put some optimal grease there on the spline. So all that's set to go. But let's move it along to here. What we've got there is pinion pivot needle bearings. Here they are here. You can see they've got a little bit of a taper on them. Now, when you knock those out, when you take them out, you get a flat punch, right? And you knock them, you do not knock them out from here. And I'll tell you why. You can see there, see the flat punch, it's sitting on a shoulder. You will destroy that shoulder if you try and force them from the outside in. So what you do is, you come in from the top and you find the lip on the lower one, which is there, okay? And you knock it out in that direction. You knock them out in an outwards direction. So that one there gets knocked out down in that direction. And then you reverse the final drive over and you come in from the top to knock the other one out. Never ever knock them out towards the inside of that coupling area. Never ever. It must be knocked out from underneath here, outwards on both of them. Knock them out outwards. Now, before we get on to the bushes, these pinion pivot needle roller bearings, if you like, they're tapered. You can actually feel the notching. Just rotate that in a race like that. You'll feel the roughness. That's that Brunelling where the needle rollers, where those needles actually become notchy. They make impressions, needle roller impressions on that inner race. You can just rotate it and you can feel all the notching. Look, while you're in there, don't muck about with these things. If you still decide to go with the original needle bearings, just replace them. Just replace them. If you've gone to the trouble of pulling all that apart, just replace them, because it may be quite some time before you get back in there again. And at least you'll know that if they're new, you'll have a good 40 to 60,000 kilometres of a carefree aspect where that pinion pivot area is. Now this is the gearbox input shaft. Now that one there was fairly dry. I was lucky I got to it in time. What you do is you check out the splines, in particular the tops of the teeth. These still present reasonably well. Okay, so they've still got, they're upright, they're not waved off in a certain fashion. They're not waved off in a wave formation off to one rotation, which can happen, and they're still reasonably intact. Okay, you can feel it with your finger. There's a nice smooth edge on top. There's no sharp edge as such, and no abrasiveness. So got to that in time, and I think it had been a good 60,000 Ks. It was dry. Yeah, so whenever you get hold of one of these bikes, a used bike in particular, I suggest that you pull out the final drive, you pull out the paralever, the tunnel, the drive shaft, undo the swing arm pivot pins, disconnect that, and undo the 4 mounting bolts, right, for the gearbox. There's 1, there's 2, there's 3, and there's 4, and the top ones, of course, are in the airbox, air filter assembly, and you undo a bottom nut on that air filter assembly to get to where you are. Okay, so here you can see the input shaft and input gearbox case is clean. That's always a very, very good idea to clean up all this, get rid of all that dirt and gunk in and around here where you're about to put a new seal in. I'm waiting on a new seal to arrive, and I'm also waiting on a few other bits and pieces, namely the puller here to take off the gearbox output coupling that attaches to the drive shaft. I'm waiting on a puller to arrive. So until then, we'll proceed when that arrives. What we have here is the output shaft seal. I've put a new one in, but just looking at that very tight area between the shaft and the gearbox casing. Okay, so basically from the splines through to that edge line there where my fingernail is, it's fairly tight. So what I suggest you do is, if you have one of these little slide hammers, they're very, very handy. And you actually insert a little self-tapper into that screw chuck that you can see that the self-tapper is attached to. And the actual, this is an actual lip seal slide hammer remover. So on the end of this shaft, it's got a plain head driver bit that fits into the cross-cut plain head on the self-tapper itself. So you can also get a very, very fine little drill just to put a little pilot hole in there, very gently of course, just to allow that self-tapper to anchor itself, and then you commence to pull it out with this slide hammer. And then when you put it in, I'll just get onto that. Now when we put the new lip seal in to, now this here is the input shaft side, the input side of the gearbox. So as you can see there, the new lip seal has been seated. I've used a 27mm socket to saddle that shaft, and as you can see, it fits nicely over that seal. But you can actually start to insert it after its recess is cleaned up. So once it's cleaned, you can put a little bit of grease around the lip itself. Be careful not to sort of come into contact with these splines. You will have clearance because the shaft diameter that the lip seats on is raised by about 1 or 2 mil. The outer diameter of the shaft that the lip comes into is 1 or 2 mil larger than the OD of those splines, so you will have clearance to put it on. So just first with your fingers on both sides, you'll get it started. You probably get it about halfway, half to 3/4, and then to actually seat it, put that 27mm socket on and tap it very gently. Now I've used a brass hammer to do that, so as you don't upset the top of your nice socket. Okay, with the same sort of breaker bar and extension bar positioned as we did to remove the hex bolt, we continue to screw that down once we've locked in those anchor points. That there's a 27mm socket, long reach, and it goes all the way down so it doesn't slip off while you're undoing it. But it's just about to free itself. And there we have it. There's the collar. It's freed itself. And as you can see, that shiny band where my finger is, you can see that shiniest band. That's where the lip seal runs on. And we have a leak there, so that's the purpose of this task, to replace that lip seal there. The covers come off because the bolts here, as you can see just there, the tips, they've just taken the skim off the oil seal. We'll now remove that and do what we need to do and replace it with the new one. Okay, so as you can see, down in that recess, in through the hole of the special tool, you can see the hex nut that has been released. Now, what we'll do is we'll remove that hex nut, and we will then use our little friend here, our little friend there, to screw that down. And as you noticed, inside here, there's a special thread. Now I had to use heat. I got that up to about 85, 90 degrees Celsius to unseize that nut. It was torqued right up. It was tight. So the next step is we put punchinello. We take that off. We take this off, and we put that collar inset down underneath there, and then we screw that there, and you can see a little detent ball there. Right, I'll touch that to show you what I infer. That little detent ball there fits down on that shaft. You can see a little a detent recess there that fits down into there, and it pulls the whole assembly off. Okay, so once we have the special tool attached for removing the hex lock nut out on the output shaft of the gearbox, we then get a little bit of a Tommy bar that fits through the holding eye that I pointed out, which is here, but it's also on that side. So the Tommy bar's in there, and I've actually increased the purchase by getting an old stanchion fork tube to make work a little bit lighter. On the other side, of course, we've got that big long breaker bar, and we're about to crack that torque as we speak. All right, the special tool that we're going to remove that seal underneath this flange with is this little fellow here. He's got his 4 little bolts, and as you can see, those 4 bolts will attach to here, but we need to remove this nut. Okay, we'll now proceed with the replacement of the gearbox, the airhead gearbox output shaft seal. All right, so we'll just point that out to you. So what we need to do is we need to take off this hex nut. Okay, now that's on there with considerable torque, and then it will enable us to take off this flange that's attached to the drive shaft by 4, 2, 3, and 4 Torx bolts. And you can just see the seal underneath, just there. That's the seal that we need to extract. Now, once we've attached this special tool, it forms part of the puller assembly, but for this case, to take that lock nut off, that hex nut off, we just use half of that special tool, leaving the access above there open. And we then have another special tool, which is basically a 24 mil socket. And as you can see, you can tell by the marks there that this has been turned down in a lathe. And you can see the shoulder there, which will tell you just how much that's been turned down in a lathe. You can actually see the cutting tools marks, impressions on that after it's been turned down. But this particular tool fits down into there, and you turn it around until it seats over that hex lock nut. Then on the sides here, you will have a hole here to put a Tommy bar in, and with that Tommy bar you can also use an old stanchion, an old fork tube stanchion, to give you more leverage. And of course I'll be using a fairly long breaker bar, which will give me the extended length, creating more purchase to actually snap free the torque of that nut. Okay, so here we are with the output shaft exposed. The old seal has been removed. Now let's continue on. So just here where my finger is touching, I'll use a smaller one. That surface there is where the new lip seal will come on. Now here, what you have up the top here is a V groove. Now the information I've ascertained on that is if you put your lip seal in situ, if you fit that in, you will still have a hole up here on the V groove. Now that one there was for earlier applications. That remained exposed. It remained open with the lip seal in and acted, as you can see, it's on the top of the gearbox, and it acted as an early model breather. So it appears the gearbox castings haven't changed. From a production point of view, Motorrad, BMW, has left that as it was. But on the paralevers, most certainly, paralever models as opposed to the mono levers, on the paralevers, up here is your speedo drive. Now you can see down here further, you have a little drive, right? It's a that drive there actually is turned by that worm drive there, if you like, okay, which is the flange output where your drive shaft is attached to. So that there drives this little speedo drive here. Now, where the speedo drive cable comes down onto there and goes to your speedo, where the speedo drive cable fits, just here is a little bolt. It's like a 10 millimeter hex head. Okay, a 6 mil thread, big one. Well, that one there has a hole on the top of the bolt, and it has a hole and acts as a breather. All right, so we don't need to have this little V drive here on later paralever models. The breather is through that bolt. The speedo drive securing bolt has a hole in it, and it allows everything to breathe. So when we put that in, we will seal that up with a little bit of RTV silicon gasket maker. And I will also put on the edge here of this oil seal, you can see this ridging. I'll also put a little bit, a thin smear of RTV silicon gasket maker on there. And of course, when you fit these, you just put a light smear of grease around that lip. See where my finger's touching? Light smear of grease around there. So as when you first start it up, it doesn't run dry and nick or tear ever so slightly that lip. Okay, so the next step, of course, is to put that output shaft flange on. You'll feel it click in. Now, what actually secures that to this shaft, that's a taper fit. I shouldn't have lots of problems getting it off because it's been on there for some time and it pretty well freezes itself securely. But you'll need a puller to get it off. But putting it back in, it just slips back in. And as it was when it first came off, you'll feel that these edges here are just below that edge line. The flange sits just below. But what will secure it, now it's most important that you don't forget, there's a wave washer. I'll get some focus on there for you. That's a wave washer. You can just see the curvature on it amidst the backdrop of the gearbox. And there's another nut, the nut that you've taken off. So those two items need to go back onto there. I had to use a magnet to get that out. Okay, but there you have it. There's a wave washer. And then the nut sits onto there. And to put that on, of course, I'll use some Loctite on that, and the grade that I use is over there, Loctite 270. It's the same one that I use on those pinion pivot bolts, and also use them on the swing arm pinion pivot bolts on those threads. Must be heated to get that off. To break that Loctite up, so as you can remove it, it must be heated up to about 100 degrees Celsius. Okay. Okay, so as you can see, I've fitted the lip seal, the new gearbox output shaft lip seal, which is that there that you can see, the brown seal. And just here, it might not be highlighted on the phone, but where I'll get a little pointer here, an old bit of brake line. So where the tip of that brake line is touching just here, that's actually like a little bit of a chamfer there, like a little bit of a taper. Okay, so that helps the seal. You can actually push that in, you know, equally, making sure that it goes in equally on all 4 points. Push it in with your thumbs and index fingers, and you'll feel it seat, completely seat and go no further. And that's where it's located. Most importantly, up here, I'm just trying to, but that V, I've put some RTV gasket, silicon gasket maker up there, and I've sealed that because, like I said, up here, in that point there, we have a little 10mm bolt, a 6mm thread on it, and it's got a hole that goes all the way through that bolt and a head, which allows this gearbox to breathe. So that breather up there, that V, more so for the older models, but not so for the para levers. Okay, those concepts with the monolever, yes, but not the para lever. And also, don't forget, around this lip, around the lip seal, just put a thin smear of grease around that lip. Okay, so now we're putting the final drive flange back on. And like I said earlier, don't forget that heavy duty spring washer, and don't forget the output shaft flange retaining nut. But before you put that on, it's most important to clean the tapered tip of the output shaft, gearbox output shaft, and the tapered mating surface of the flange. Now you can use brake cleaner to clean those compartments. They need to be oil film free, oil film free, oil residual free. That tapered mating contact surface needs to be completely dry, because it helps the binding process once you tighten this nut. And you need a good long torque wrench. 300 or 400 mils, not going to cut it. You need an extremely long one, because the torque value for that output fastening nut, flange fastening nut, is 220 Newton meters. So it equates to about 163 foot-pounds, okay? And you need this special tool. You really need that to remove the output flange and also to put it back on. Without that, with that type of torque, you've got Buckleys or none in removing it. So there you have it. That's that process there. I've just completed it. It's done. My son is the muscle behind that. My son. Thank you. All right, so before fitting any lip seal, make sure that that surface, that inner ID surface area there, where the outer diameter of the seal slips into, is clean. Make sure it's clean before the new one is inserted. So with most lip seals, when you get them, you compare them. There's the old one. There's a bit of overshadowing there that's creating some distortion. That's the new one. And when you feel that lip on the inner diameter of the old seal, it's somewhat hardened compared to the softness of the new. So heat, time, aging actually starts to harden those rubbers, and they don't create the sealing effect of the more softer, resilient rubber of the new, and that's what we want. And also, before insertion, take a look there, and you can see where the previous lip seal sank. It's about 2.5 mil beyond the end of the taper. So I just point it out with my fingernail just there. See with the shiny surface? That's the corroded surface. So that will be your benchmark. That's what you will aim for. You'll push it into that point. That'll give you a correct measure as to how far you insert lip seals. Where the previous one was is X. X marks the spot. Now, okay, whilst opportunity presents, we'll go to the gear lever shaft oil seal. That's the gear lever shaft oil seal. Yet again, another lip seal. So what I do is, on that edge, just there, I put a paddle pop stick or some wood. And why I use that at its fulcrum point is because we're going to use a lip seal remover. I've only got one hand, so it's becoming increasingly hard to get in there and do what we need to do. So there's the gist of it. You put the tool in there, like thus, as you can see. And then you pull it out. But the rate at which you insert this tool, and make sure it's measured, because you do not want to scrape that outside wall or scratch it. Because any harsh scratching like that will create a pathway for oil to leak around the outer diameter of the seal. So measure it, put it in about that far. Not there, about there. And pull the seal out. You've got the understanding of what I imply. And where you lever that oil seal remover, you put, I use paddle pop sticks, okay? You put that there, and at the pivot point, it's not going to burr this lip over. But you need to keep that intact because it's tapered. There's a small taper there, and it assists with the insertion of the lip seal. Now, I'm not going to worry about replacing the Kickstarter shaft lip seal, which is located behind the Kickstarter mount, and simply because it wasn't leaking. So I'll just leave well enough alone there. Okay, so as you can see, the spring is inset. The spring of the lip seal is facing the gearbox. So it's the flat spot here that faces out, and the spring faces in towards the gearbox. So I've got here is an 18mm socket that fits nicely onto that robust part of the face, the solid part, and I'll just gently bump that in with a brass hammer right up until that mark that I discussed earlier. Right, so as you can see, as made known earlier, the corroded mark is still exposed, and the lip seal, the top of the lip seal, has just come into that shiny area where it had once rested before. That's your mark, and follow it, and that'll give you the correct depth for each lip seal. There are applications where the depth of the lip seal is important. So be guided by that new shiny surface and the corroded surface. There's a distinct line there, that pre-existing fit that must be followed. And again, make sure the spring is facing towards the gearbox. Okay, I only got one hand, but you start it pushing it with its fingers, and then we'll get a socket, a nice socket, which can be used as a drift that's equivalent to this diameter, just short of the outer diameter of that lip seal, and then you can tap it in. Use a brass hammer when you're tapping your socket so you don't dent or obliterate or wreck your sockets. Okay, so as mentioned before, this gearbox had been removed. Now, this is a very interesting work plate. It's secured by your vise, and it, in no uncertain terms, exposes all the components: output flange, clutch, rod, actuator, opening, kickstarter, lip seal, and of course that input spline, shaft, seal area. So everything that you need to do, even if you have to take this top cover off to get to the internals of the gearbox, this particular tool, I got it out of the UK. It's a group by the name of Flat Racer. As you can see, they have most, if not all, of the special tools that you require to work on these airheads. While you have this out, even while you're disassembling it, whilst you're removing it, the gearbox, from the engine, you must pay particular attention to this little fine outstanding fellow there. What is it that you might ask? It is the neutral switch. When neutral is selected between first and second via the selector, it allows the electrics, namely the idiot light, to display neutral on your dash. Now, where these can have problems is when you're removing the gearbox, it will often hit or come into contact on the cradle of the frame. This one here is getting on. The terminals are loose. So whilst it's out, I'll be replacing it. You can see that fairly big, thick, where my fingernail is, thick crush washer up there. So I'll be replacing that, and I'll be extremely careful when fitting this gearbox back into the bike so as that there clears the cradle, the left-hand cradle of the bike. And this gearbox will go back in via the left-hand side of the bike. Do not try and remove it from the right side. Even though you might succeed, it will end up scratching your Kickstarter. So these gearboxes, in nature of configuration, are more suited to be removed from the left-hand side of the bike. Okay, so like I said, I had secured the two top gearbox mounting socket head bolts, and in here, don't forget that one there. That's that airbox mounting bolt to secure the airbox. So you've actually got three main fasteners that secures that. In underneath here, right, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a hose there. I'm just pointing to it. Very hard to get that depth of field. So the tip of the optimal grease, I'll get my finger in there. That hose there needs to connect into there. This one's old, it's split, and I've actually put a little tube inside the hose to keep that together. It's a breather, it's a crankcase breather, okay? So there you have it, and I'll give you some coverage as time goes on. And most important, when you're putting this here on, there is that neutral switch up underneath the gearbox, closest to this side, about 2 inches underside, underneath from my fingertip there. And be very, very careful, they're fragile, and they have a likelihood of bottoming out on the cradle of this frame when you slide the gearbox in. So be careful that does not come into contact with this frame or any other part, because it will break and you'll have to pull the gearbox back out and fit another neutral switch. Okay, and connecting these two wires to the neutral switch is important. And the bottom mounting bolt here, don't forget to put that earth wire on there. If you don't put that on, you'll have all sorts of strange things happening with your electrics. Okay, take care, all the best. And from here, I'll secure the gearbox, and then I will connect the swing arm with the pivot bolts, and then I will attach the drive shaft Torx head bolts to the output flange of the gearbox. Stay tuned. Now, I'm just trying to get some focus here. You can just see that brush. This is a normal toothbrush, and once you've cleaned up those splines, these bristles usually come to where the tip of where the bottom of my finger is. That's about their original length. Now I've cut them back about half. They're about a third of their original, about a half of their original length. So from there to there is their original length. Now why I've done that is it gives the bristles more spring, more strength. and it enables those bristles to get down in between. You can still see some optimal paste there, right, in between the bristles. But it gives the bristles, cutting them back to about half the length, it gives them more strength. And with more strength, those bristles work the grease down in between the splines. Very, very important that you get full coverage, in particular down into the valleys of the teeth. Of course, you're going to have that clutch assembly, female end, sliding into the input shaft splines of the gearbox. So cut those brushes down to about half, and that grease will work into and between those splines more effectively. All right, everyone. Look, I've only got one hand with this smartphone. Now, in the earlier coverage, I showed you the input side of the gearbox, in particular the input shaft with the splines, okay? So what I used is, you've just got to get rid of any rust or old grease that's on there. I cleaned up those gearbox input splines with that wire brush. They were all symmetrical. There was no curvature of the teeth. They had a little bit of a flat spot on top, and they looked like they had just come out of the factory. I was very fortunate that I got to this when I did. There was a I got traces of old grease on my fingertips. So the last remnants of grease were still there. So, you know, how long's a string since the previous owner has been in there? It was due. Slightly past due, but it was due. I got there in the right time, and I actually cleaned it up with a wire brush, and then I got like a brake cleaner, and I cleaned up those splines, removed all traces of old grease. It's very important that you clean it up back to bare metal, and that way the proper grease, who knows what they had done before, but this grease here, Castrol, and they call it paste white tea molube alloy. Okay, so that's the grease from Munich Motorcycles here in Oz, and it is the one that is specified by BMW. That's the one that's been approved. Okay, and that grease there that I just showed you, that will also go on the final drive splines. I've already got it on the final drive splines, and the female end of the final drive input splines, where they male-female splines meet. So there you have it. Sorry I couldn't give you any previous coverage, but just two hands, can't hold the phone. And once we get it in there, like I said, I had already put a new gearbox seal in there, and of course the final the output seal of the gearbox, that had been replaced also, as you had seen in previous coverage. I've put the airbox back on there and just slightly secured the two gearbox mounting socket head bolts. One there and one there. All right, and just an additional note, right, before you put that airbox assembly on, before you attach it to this gearbox, make sure that you put that fuel hose balance tube in. All right, if you forget to do so, it can be done, but you've got to really snake that around to get it to find the other hole on the other side. So much easier to lay that down and fit it, and then fit the gearbox, the airbox assembly, airbox base assembly onto that. All right, and the other thing is, most important, do not forget, before you attach your swing arm, whilst there is still access through the back, you can see the output shaft there, and you can also see the clutch here, that one there. Put your push rod in. Don't forget to put your push rod in. Put that push rod in now whilst you have access. Don't forget. Cheers. And when you put the gearbox push rod in, it's very, very important to put a smear of grease here on the tip. You can just see that white there. Okay? Now, I have labelled it. You can just see that F there at the tip of the rod. That's the front. So that goes to the front. And of course, this other bit here goes to the back, to the clutch actuating lever. So that one there, it's got a reduced diameter. It's been turned down. It's got a little taper there, tapering up to a larger ID. That part there, that little elongated bit, goes thus, in that direction, So fit that up before you fit your swing arm. Okay, and most importantly, feed that fuel hose up underneath the airbox base. Make sure that's in there before you tighten all this up. You can snake it through. It's much easier just to insert that before that airbox base goes on. Okay, after we've sorted out those wires on the gearbox neutral switch, which can only, which can be more conveniently fitted before the gearbox slips in, we need to tighten up. Find the socket head bolt for there. They're actually gearbox mounting bolts. So one there that you can see over on the far right of the airbox assembly, one on the far left, and there's also a bolt. It's a hex head bolt. You have another one down here. Don't forget to connect that brown earth wire. You can just see it there, my finger's on it. It's an I terminal that fits onto that engine socket head mounting bolt. Okay? If you don't connect that up, you'll have all sorts of problems with the LED, with the idiot lights up there. So make sure that's earthed out. All right, once you've secured all those gearbox to engine socket head mounting bolts, 1, 2, 3, and directly opposite on the right hand side. Now remember, the right hand side is not anchored into the case, into the crankcase. It's one long bolt with a nut on the end. That's on the other side, right hand side. So once we've done that, we then start to put our little trumpets, airbox trumpets in. You can see this here. I'll just put my finger on it. That nozzle there will fit into that fellow there, the crankcase breather. Now, okay, the gearbox is here resting on the cradle. It's ready to be fitted to the engine. Most important, hear me out. Before you put that gearbox in, the new neutral switch here that we fitted, you can just see it there. It's got two spade terminals and two spade connectors. On the R100GS PD 1995, the two spade connectors that fit onto the spade terminals, both wires, as you can see, brown and brown. Doesn't matter where you put them. You can have this one over there and that one over there, or vice versa. Doesn't matter. There's no strict order. But connect them before you mount the gearbox, because accessibility underneath there is practically impossible. Unless you've got a very, very long, elongated pair of pointy pliers. But even that, with twisting and moving off to the side, is difficult. Now's the time to do it. Now, I'm just going to use an extension bar here as a pointer. Okay, clutch actuating arm. Is that there? Up here is the clutch actuator locating hex bolt, 10 mil. Now, when you tighten that up, don't be monkey fisted and tighten that up, because all you're going to do is clamp up those two tongues so tight that it will create resistance on this pivot point. And as it creates resistance on that pivot point, it will load up your clutch up there on the switch block, your hand lever. And if you feel like doing some durable exercise, feel free to do that in Sydney traffic or elsewhere. Best of luck with that. So, do not over tighten that hex bolt. There are two tongues there, and I'll show you. I'll try and get some imaging. Okay, so the next step is we slide the spring down into the boot. You'll feel the end of this spring locate comfortably down into that boot. I suggest at this stage it's a must that you put the clamp, the screw clamp, onto the boot with that screw head pointing down to the ground, so as you can bring a screwdriver up underneath the bike and tighten it. If it's inverted, it's going to be a lot more difficult, if not impossible, because of the confinement. But you'll have access to tighten it from underneath, from the underside of the bike. So put that screw head on the underside of the bike, put that on and clamp it up as an assembly. Remember, if that one there fits down into that area I pointed out earlier on on that big thrust race. Okay, the next order of assembly is that you refit those trumpets. There's the alignment that you seek. Okay, so as you can see here, there's a shoulder on the rubber trumpet that actually comes through on each opening, and that shoulder butts up against the airbox opening here. You can just see the rubber shoulder, and that sits in and around there, and it also butts up to this metal trumpet airbox sleeve, which of course the manifold rubber carb to airbox will slide over that and have a Jubilee clamp. So we do that. Once we've tended to that, don't put the carbies on just yet, because they will affect accessibility for affecting other tasks like refitting the speedo drive and access in and around the flange Torx bolts that secure the drive shaft flange to the gearbox output flange of the gearbox. So just leave all those carbies until last, so you can get all your pinkies in and around here. And of course, don't put the wheel on just yet, because with that wheel still off, you can see, and I'll get my magical little pointer, that there is the clutch actuator push rod assembly, and you've got far more accessibility in and around there to work to fit that. If you've got the rear wheel on, coupling, swing arm attached, the accessibility is restrictively confined. So also, look, just there, you can see the tip of the clutch rod in the middle. See him? Do not forget at this stage to slide that in whilst the opportunity allows you to do that. A lot of those other videos that cover these seem to leave people in the dark. They tend to create a guessing competition. It's the simple things that are also just as important as the most complex things. Okay, now the next thing that goes into that push rod recess, that hole there that you see, is this little fellow here. I'll get some focus for you. There he is. Now, you can see the hole there. Okay, I'll just touch it. That hole there where my thumb is, that's where the push rod goes into. That's where it seats. The push rod that you can just see protruding there, right? Remember, we've slid that in now at this stage. Well, it actually slides through onto that hole. So that hole that you see there is forward. This one here is towards the front of the motorcycle. That one there points to the back. You can see that proud rod inset from the outer diameter. And in here, in that little area there, is a locator for the spring, the clutch actuator return spring. Okay, so I'm just going to have to get my kneecap dirty here because I've only got one hand holding the phone. So that spring actually slides down into there. See how it sits in there nicely? Right, so that goes to the front and the spring goes to the back. So just showing you the bike, that goes to the front and the spring to the back of the bike. And you fit that up now. There may be a bit of an overlap here. Update, last Apple update. They give us pause for a change. Haven't done it for years, but they've all of a sudden decided to do that. Another little muck up again. All right, so once again, down in there, we've got the clamp, we've got the rubber boot and the spring inside and the clutch actuator. Put all that together onto the clutch actuator, force that in there, put the bolt through the clutch actuator pivot and put all that on together. Don't try and do it separately with the boot and the clamp and then try and reach for the actuator and put it on. Just have it all together as an assembly, hold it with your hand, push it on. It doesn't matter if the lip doesn't go over the housing, as long as you get that pivot bolt in, and then it's a lot more easier to manhandle, get the lip, the rubber boot lip onto the locator on the housing. And also once you get down to here, when you put the clutch cable drum in, use that wood there. Use a piece of wood so as not to scratch the frame paint. And as you force that forward, you put the clutch cable drum into that floor. That's the trick. Okay, thank you. Now, before we put this clutch actuating arm in, I'll point it out if I can get there, which I probably... Up here, there's an original needle roller bearing. Now, I have replaced that with a ball bearing. I've done away with the needle rollers and I've replaced it with a ball bearing. I find that the ball bearing race seems to provide a smoother transitional movement. It's far more smoother and it reduces the load at the clutch lever, hand clutch lever. You can certainly feel the lightened load there. And let me tell you, you know, if you're out and about in a big adventure or in and around a fairly busy suburban area, it really, you know, takes that load off the hand. All right. So if you find that you've got the original needle roller in there, what you need to do is you need to take that out, take it apart, clean all the grit and grime that's accumulated in that roller over the years. As you pull it apart, you look at the inner diameter of the races and you look for what's known as Brinelling. And Brinelling is a process where the needle rollers have etched, or if you like, made impressions, indentations in amongst that race on the inner diameter, and you'll feel it because it'll feel quite notchy. So whilst opportunity presents, I would do away with the needle rollers and I would replace it with a ball bearing. Take it into a ball bearing place. They'll look at the measurements and they'll give you a replacement bearing that suits, a replacement ball bearing that suits. So we're just about to fit that up into that location where the clutch rod is. And once again, here is a toothbrush. The bristles have been cut back from about half. They were once about there, disproportionate through imaging, I know, but those bristles have been cut back by a good third to a half. Why do I do that? Because it strengthens the bristles and it allows them to get down in between the V, down into the valley of those splines, and allows for good all spline surface coverage. There you go. Just a little household item called the toothbrush. Bristles cut back down to about half. Okay, now we'll progress onto the paralever drive shaft tunnel. Okay, drive shaft housing, call it what you will. And here we have these bearings, which were still very, very good. You can actually clamp this between my legs. You can actually take this little rubber seal. What it does is it prevents grit and debris, if you like, entering the I think they're a needle roller. Yes, they are. Preventing debris from getting in between the inner and outer races of the bearing and into the needle rollers. Okay, so these were taken out, they were cleaned, and there was no notching, no resistance. There was a smooth transitional rotation without any resistance or obstruction. The bearings were good, and considering that these come out every 30,000 miles, or if you like, up to about 50,000 kilometers, 40,000 is good, right? You take them out, you clean them, you check them, and you repack them with grease. But that little seal prevents dust and debris getting into there. Now, on the inside, of course, there's no rubber seal. It's pretty hard to get that camera to focus. But there's no rubber seal on the inside of that bearing. And I think their outlook is that this is completely housed, you know, no dirt or debris supposedly supposed to not get in there, but it does, and they do need cleaning, and they do need to be checked and retained if good, but if you have resistance and notching after you've cleaned them, replace them. And further along from the paralever tunnel or drive shaft housing, if you like, swing arm, for want of another word, we then go on to other parts of that assembly. One in particular is our friend, the drive shaft, which is terrible focus. Anyway, in there we have the drive shaft yoke splines. Now they have all been cleaned. They have been cleaned, and I'm about to apply Optimal T paste, which BMW strongly suggests. Now that there is to be cleaned thoroughly of old grease. Do not mix greases together. They're non-compatible, and in most cases one will break down the other. they will react and break down the lubrication quality that each has. But it's most important that the right one goes in there. And before you put it in, it must be cleaned of all debris and all previous grease content. Now what I use to clean those splines, I use contact cleaner, CRC contact cleaner, extra strength precision electronic cleaning solvent. Why do I use this? I use it because it does not leave any film behind. Degreasers and brake cleaner leaves a residual behind, and those residuals that both brake cleaner and degreaser leave behind break down the lubrication or greasing effect of the grease optimal tea paste that you're using. This one here cleans and leaves no residual behind. It's a good solvent and it flashes off, dries off into atmosphere. So here's what I'm using for the spline lubrication. This is the highly recommended spline lube grease, if you like. And it's a paste white tea from Castrol, Mollab alloy. Let there be the one. Okay, don't forget to, before you fit this swing arm on, on the disassembly, what I did was marked here, that index mark there, with a bit of white. That way, this particular boot, rubber boot, coupling, flange, boot, goes back on the same way that it came off. So therefore the pre-formed impression, if you like, sits exactly where it had been before. So it recreates or regains the original seal from memory that this boot possessed. Okay, just a bit of housekeeping tips in relation to that. When we put this in relation to there, it goes up and around to the left. So it goes in at a 15 or 20 degree angle and then sweeps around to the left and up into position for both right hand and left hand pivot, swing arm pivot bearings to be placed. Okay, so like I said, come in at an angle like that and swing the swing arm off to the left. Come in at that angle there and swing it off to the left hand side, right? And the left hand side swings around into there first, then the right side of the swing arm lines up with the pin here. Fit the right hand pin first, support that so you don't stress out the bearing until you fit the left hand swing arm bearing pin. Okay, now when we get to here, just hold your breath, and you've got a very, very confined space in which to work in. With the swing arm at that angle that you see there, and near on a just short 35 degree angle, fully suspended under its own weight, it allows for a larger access area at the top here. Okay, so with your pinkies, just hope you haven't got banana fingers. If you've got small fingers, you rotate that drive shaft flange around until it lines up with the output, gearbox output flange, and you then commence. There's a bit of glare here with the plastic, but these are new Torx nuts. These are new flange Torx nuts. Now, as you can see the pink colouring there on the threads. They're Loctite impregnated threads. Now, what happens there is, once you get up to a certain torque, the molecular structure of the Loctite is such that when it reaches a set torque, it releases, it activates, and locks those threads in situ. Okay, a very, very good idea, and most important, because you do not want those gearbox output shaft flange to drive shaft flange Torx retaining bolts to come loose. If they come loose, you are going to do some considerable damage. You will distort and damage quite a lot of components tied up in that transitional drive line of connection. Okay, so make sure that they are torqued properly. They are torqued to the specified torque, and we will get to that. We will get to that in the next video. Okay, so you can see here, I've got to hold the torch. You can just see there, I'll peel it back. There's one Torx nut. Like I said, let that swing arm drop down under its own weight. And up the top there, where my finger is, you can see a Torx bolt that's attached the drive shaft flange to the gearbox output flange. That's the first one. So what we do now is we just rotate gently, and once we get that fiddly second one, the first one and the second bolt will be fiddly, but once you get those two, you'll have the two faces symmetrically aligned, face to face, and the third and fourth Torx bolts will be applied with much more greater ease. There you have it. Just proceed as follows, as stated. Thanks. All right, to torque up those Torx bolts, drive line flange to the gearbox output flange Torx bolts, you need a special tool. This tool here is shaped and sized, if you like, to fit into that small recess. In addition to that, you need a good quality torque wrench. The R100GS's, that particular torque for the flange bolts, gearbox output flange bolts, is 29 foot-pound, which is exactly the same as 29 pound-foot. Okay, so 29 foot-pound is the fastening torque tightening value for those flange bolts. Okay, got one hand. I can't show you it being performed, but that's fairly straightforward. Okay, you can just see two that have been there. So like I said, the third and fourth will be much more easier now that it's symmetrically aligned. And look, to rotate that, come down the bottom end here. And you'll see the end of the drive shaft, the female splines that will attach to the male spline end of the final drive. Just rotate it from down there. Rotate it from down there so as you get the next available opening, Torx bolt flange opening. Okay? Rotate it from down there to get that. Alright, so on the final drive, the pinion pivot bearings, I am replacing the needle rollers that BMW fitted to them. Those needle rollers are just in my book, they serve some purpose, but they're not the B-end all-end application. You get a lot of Brinelling, etching of the needle rollers into the bearing outer race, and you get a lot of notching. It's really premature, the collapse or deterioration of that bearing. It's not suited for this application. Like the needle roller is designed to rotate repetitively 360 degrees. It's a cyclic repeating action. So what I'm fitting is I'm fitting these bushes. Mark Morrissey also has a section on YouTube about them. It's a far more, I feel, far more robust application. And in there you've got like don't know if you can see it, another depth of field problem that the smartphone can't overcome. But just down in there, there's a little grub screw. Down in there, a little Allen socket head screw. You take that out and you can actually fit, in that kit comes an extended grease nipple where every 10,000 Ks, you can grease these without that comprehensive disassembly. Just perfect. A far more practical solution than those needle rollers. Okay, so what we're doing here is, if I can just separate that with one hand, wish me luck. I have. Oh, Jesus. A bit of a vacuum in there, that's why I was a bit hesitant. But in there, you can see that that's a phosphor bronze bush. Phosphor bronze bush. Okay, so that actually absorbs lubrication and far better application. Okay, just continuing on. The swing arm now is attached. These are your swing arm pins. They have a 6mm socket, a 6mm Allen key wrench that fits inset here where the pointer is. You tighten those initially at 15 foot-pound, back them off about 10 or 15 degrees, then tighten those pins, swing arm pivot pins, to 7.5 foot-pounds and no more than 9 foot-pounds. So 8 foot-pounds is fine, 8.5. Okay, but first you preload them, that's the term. You preload them to 15 foot-pounds, back them off anti-clockwise 10 or 15 degrees, reset the torque wrench to 7.5 or 8 foot-pounds if you like, but no more than 9. Tighten them up. Once set, you then tighten down the thin lock nut. You tighten that down to about 75 foot-pound. Okay, so what I've done, you can see it there, is there's a white mark on the nut. There's also a white mark on the pin, swing arm pivot pin. So from time to time, I look at these witness marks and I can tell if that setting has been disturbed. It's a good idea. Okay, then you put your cap, dust cap, back on there. So we won't tighten down those gearbox flange Torx bolts until I get a rear wheel on there, and then I can lock that in to hold it for the output flange Torx bolts tightening. So that phosphor bronze bush, it actually gets lubricated, and I'll just show you a little bit more of it. You've got this little cutaway there on the top there. You can see the hole there. Well, that's where the grease comes in, that's fed by an adaptable grease nipple, elongated adaptable grease nipple. You shoot the grease down through there, it travels through that shaft, comes out there, and it squishes out either way down into there. Just a perfect solution. I can remember Rubber Chicken racing, I think, over in the States. They used to have this concept here, but the only way to lubricate it every 15 or 20,000 Ks, I can't remember correctly, the only way to have lubricated that bush through Rubber Chicken racing was disassembly, which is what we're trying to avoid. This process here, lubrication while still in situ without the disassembly, is by far a much better concept. Okay, so the next step now is this here configuration fits into there, but we've got an interference fit there. So what we're going to do to be able to slip this bush into there is we're going to heat this. Okay, we've got our propane gas over here, MAP gas if you like. We're going to heat that to 100 degrees Celsius, which will expand this opening here, and this little fatto being cold will just slip straight in there. Some videos I've seen, you know, you get some heavy-fisted, anxious type fellows that belt that home cold. No. Heat it up first, slip the cold bush in. Okay, so we've seated these bushes in the final drive on both sides. They're a very good application, very well thought of. That's completely blank there. The pins fit in there, just short of there with 0 tolerance on the nut side. And the fixed pin is torqued down to about 105 Newton meters, 77 foot-pounds, thereabouts. Very, very good application. No grit or debris gets in there. Sealed. Very nice. So before the final drive goes on, make sure, as you can see here, you've fitted your boot, because that there, lining that shaft up there, which has already been greased with approved lube, the special one, Optimal T from Castrol, that they recommend. Before you put that on, make sure the boot's on, because you don't want to line that up. That's very problematic, trying to get that up into there. It's quite a few goes. If you can get it within the first two, you're doing extremely well. So we're just about to fit that up and slide the pins in through there to locate the final drive onto the swing arm. Okay, this is the fixed lock pin, fixed bush lock pin. So as you can see, I've removed inset there at the bottom of the Allen key hex head. You can see I've removed the little socket head plug, grease plug. It also has one, and it too can be greased. Both sides can be greased. Great concept, absolutely great. No disassembly required. You just take that off, put your grease nipple in, and I can't stress highly enough, if you have a grease gun, half a sweep of the grease gun lever. That's all you need, because it's a very, very tight void, a very small void in there with not much clearance. So there's no need, you know, trying to manhandle the grease gun and trying 3, 4, or, you know, sweeps. It's not going anywhere. You're just going to get a whole heap of hydraulic lock, and you could quite possibly risk, with so much pressure in there, punching out the brass threads of the grease nipple application. So just half a sweep, gently Bentley, that's all you need. There's not much grease that goes in there, because it's a very small void with very, very tight clearances. And you'll see that when you get your paralever pivot bushes. Paralever final drive pivot bushes. Far better application than the needle rollers. Now that too uses the blue thread locker, and this too is torqued to 105 Newton meters, which is the equivalent to 77 foot-pound. And foot-pound is the same as pound-foot. 77 pound-foot or 77 foot-pound. Now the other thing I've noticed is that once you fit, this is what they call the loose pin, not the fixed pin. The fixed pin is on the other side. This is what they call the loose bearing pin. And there's the lock nut that secures it. Now what I've noticed is, once you fit, this lock nut on there and you tighten it to 105 Nm, which is about 77 foot-pound. Foot-pound, of course, is exactly the same as pound-foot. Okay, so once you tighten it to 77 foot-pound or 105 Nm, what I've done, I don't think you might just barely be able to see it, just there at 11 o'clock on the pin. There's a mark, it's about 5:02 on the minute hand of the clock, just there. I mark that so as when I tighten that to 105 Nm, I can ensure that the pin does not rotate round with the clockwise torquing of that hex head lock nut. So most important, you maintain that zero end float tolerance by witnessing it with a mark, which will let you know if that pin bearing stays in the one spot. Most important. Okay, and now what they do is they've actually got a phosphor bronze bush, as explained earlier, and the good thing about them is I've actually taken the little socket head Allen key plug screw out, and you can see down in there there's a hole, and in there you screw a brass grease nipple in there, and every 10,000 Ks you can just give it one sweep of your grease gun. Half a sweep. That's all you need. You don't need to do 2 or 3 pumps of this. It's a very confined area in there. It's tight. Half a sweep of the grease gun lever is sufficient every 10,000 Ks with a good molly grease. Okay, because all you've got is a pin that's inserted into a blind hole, into a phosphor bronze blind hole, and it's a very, very tight tolerance. When you move these pins in and out of the enclosed brass bush blind hole, the tolerance is that close that it creates a suction, and you'll notice that if you try it before you insert those pins. And when you insert these pins, they have 0 end float tolerance, 0. So you take them up to, it just barely touches or bottoms out on the phosphor bronze blind hole. Okay, now I've put in the bush kit on the swing arm pinion pivots. I've replaced the old needle roller bearings, which I think are okay, but not that good. The longevity with those applications leaves a lot to be desired. It's questionable. The longevity of those needle rollers is questionable, and like I said before, they're designed to rotate repetitively, continuously in a full 360-degree cyclic action. But when they're used in the pivot, the paralever pivot application, they're only rocking about 15 degrees, 5, 10, 15, 20, depending on how rugged the terrain is. They never ever complete a full cycle, and with that you get Brunelling. The needle rollers make a big impression in the races, and that's why after a short period of time you get this notching. These here, however, are pins. They replace, these bushes replace the needle rollers. And I think they're a far better application. I think 270 was used with a warranty concern in fear, or a fear that these might come loose and injury caused to riders. Hence the Loctite 270 reaction from manufacturers. But if you read Snowbum's most comprehensive article, he suggests using a blue thread locker, a much more material thread pitch friendly thread locker, the blue thread locker, which does not require 250 degrees Celsius to break down. It requires a far less heat, if any heat at all. 60 degrees Celsius would remove a blue thread locker quite easily. But with the blue thread locker, it's quite likely, very likely, that these threads will stay in place without loosening. And you've got to remember that this lock nut will be secured to 105 Nm, 77 foot-pound. And that lock nut will also have blue thread locker. But with those witness marks that I outlined earlier on, you can put one on the lock nut and the bearing pin, you will be able to tell with regular checks. Each time you jump off your bike, you just cast an eye down there. Yep, they're still in the same spot, because you have a witness mark or a conspic mark to identify exactly that. Now, the other important aspect is, there's one time there, I know, on an R100GS, where BMW has recommended for both the fixed pin and the loose pin lock nut secured bearing, they have recommended 270, Loctite 270. Now be very, very careful with Loctite 270. Its purpose, primarily, Loctite 270, is for a permanent application. Loctite 270 is for permanent applications. And to undo a thread that has been locked with Loctite 270, you need to heat the assembly or the immediate area. And in this case, it's going to take a long time, because your heat is going to transfer, dissipate all the way up that swing arm, all the way up to there and across. That whole thing will heat up, and it'll take some time to get that up to, wait for it, 250 degrees Celsius. So when you're heating this up to 250 degrees Celsius, no matter how far you hold this thing back, somewhere along the line, that rubber boot coming into contact with such heat is going to distort. It's going to affect it. And you're going to have this transfer of heat that I think is, and even then, it's a guessing comp as to whether or not you will release these threads on the bearing pins without destroying the aluminium threads on the swing arm cum drive shaft housing. So 270 I think is a bit of a no-no. Okay, so I will not be torquing this lock nut down. I will be waiting here. Remember that pin has 0 end float clearance. I will be not I'll not be torquing this lock nut down until the Loctite on the thread of this pin bearing dries. I'm allowing 24 hours for the Loctite to fully cure. 24 hours. Because that 105 Newton meters lock nut torque has the possibility of moving this. So I need as much cure strength from that Loctite to lock this into place as I possibly can. Now, around here, a little bit of housekeeping. Don't put the shock absorber in. Don't put that back in until we actually go back here. Don't put the speedo drive back in as yet until we go back here, peel that boot off. Once we've put the brake shoes back on and put the rear wheel on, because with the rear wheel on the ground and in gear, it actually provides a means of locking this output flange so the shaft does not rotate, and we can torque our output flange Torx bolts properly. They will be, the torque on those output flange Torx bolts will be 25 foot-pound. 25 pound-foot. Now, for any of you guys that have a problem shifting down from second into first, or from second into neutral, that happens more so as the bike heats up, once things start to expand. The likely problem is that the input splines are dry. There's no lubrication there. And as it slides into the clutch assembly, it's met with a resistance. And that creates a very hard gear change from second into first, or second into neutral, or from first back into neutral. The other problem with hard gear changing, hard second to neutral, first to neutral, neutral to second selection, the other problem is also, come round to here, the gearbox selector. Check that Allen key is torqued up properly. Check that it is secure and not loose. They're the two immediately obvious issues. The gearbox input shaft splines are dry, causing gear selection resistance problems, gear selection difficulties, and the gear selector itself, this socket head bolt coming loose. If those two issues are fine, well then it's quite likely you have an internal issue with the dogs selectors inside. Okay, that's the gear clip that's about to go on. So to get those on, you get a pair of pointy nose pliers, one part of the jaw on there and the other on top in mid set on the gear clip, and you squash and that'll bring that on. Now, once you've actually fitted the springs to the brake shoes, okay, the two shoes are fitted with the springs, you then slide one end in behind that flat washer onto the flat cam. Slide one end, slide the other end in. All right, because you've got a bit of a gap, a bridge there to get over before you cradle those. So just slide them in from this direction with both springs attached, slide that in, and then up here we'll just slide on while those two ends there are meeting, those two faces are meeting. You just slide that onto that rod. But from here, the whole assembly connected, slide it in that direction to the cam, the two flats of the shoes, onto the two sides of the flats of the cam, slide it in with that motion. And then you bring the top end of both shoes over and onto the rod. So slide the whole shoe assembly down onto there in that direction. Once they're fitted, you then slide that over onto that rod. Okay, while we're waiting for that loose pivot pin Loctite to dry, before we actually put the lock nut on it, we can do some housekeeping here. Just a tip here, while you're putting on these brake shoes, connect, before you put the brake shoes onto the hub assembly, connect both shoes, both these shoes with the springs. Don't forget these rubber dampers. They prevent the resonance or vibration of that spring coming into contact with this actuator. Now the actuator down below is a flat actuator. It's always best to grease the tip of that just with a light smear of grease on both ends of the actuator to assist the actuation or opening of both shoes. The opening of both shoes is caused by that flat bar actuator, which is of course connected to your lever on the other side. And up here, of course, there are two cam-like, two hemisphere formations that pivot on that rod or that stud that's attached to the hub assembly. And don't forget, once you fit them, to put the E-clip on. Okay, there's an E-clip that goes on there. Now, when you... Well, anyway, it's been a complex saga, but bit by bit you can break it up. I hope that the coverage that I have provided you with from final drive, namely the replacement of that final drive input seal and all the way through to the pinion pivot needle bearing replacement with bushes, all the way through to disconnecting the swing arm, replacing bearings, checking them, cleaning them, and listening to any noises that they may emit. In this case, these bearings were fine. Yes, it is an enclosed area where one expects no grit or debris to get in there, but surprisingly enough, as enclosed as it may be, there is some fine residual that gets in there, and after 40,000 Ks thereabouts, where access is required, these do need attention. And while you're in there, it always pays to have a look at those swing arm bearings. And as you recall, we had the gearbox out. We tended to the removal of that flange and the replacement of the gearbox output shaft seal. And further along up front here, we had the gearbox input seal replaced. We had the splines cleaned and re-greased with the optimal T paste that is strongly recommended for lubrication of those splines. So look, I really hope that this video has been of assistance to you, and I hope it simplifies your approach to having a go at it yourself. Okay, so we've come back to the Torx output shaft flange bolts. Now there is a special tool, I've outlined that before. The special tool is, as you can see, there's a Torx head there, and of course you put that onto a torque wrench. You torque those to 25 foot-pound. Okay, now you can get the Loctite impregnated threads. I prefer those. You don't want those bolts to come undone. And with the paralever concept, it's very hard to lock that back wheel. You've only got a monolever there, or a paralever. You haven't got your twin arm swing arm in the true sense, where you can put something through that wheel and lock it up. You'd probably need a second party to sit on the bike to gain traction on that back wheel. You engage gear, and a 10 mil, a fairly long wrench for that extra leverage effect. The 10 mil goes over there, and you tighten them up. A good firm grip until this spanner leaves an impression in your palm. I find if I get a rag, wrap that around the end of the ring, open end spanner, you can go that a bit further. That's if you haven't got that special tool that adapts a 3/8 drive for the torque wrench. So apply that pressure, leave an impression in that palm, and especially more so with the Loctite impregnated Torx bolts that hold the drive shaft flange face to the gearbox output flange face. Yeah, so after that, I've proceeded to put the airbox assembly on, the filter box housing and the filter box top with the twin snorkels. And after that, I proceeded to put the carburetors back on. As you can see, I have replaced the 40mm Bings with a McCuney upgrade. A McCuney Oz can assist you with these upgrades. I've always found McCuney Oz to be very, very helpful, and they have a good customer service portfolio, and they spend the time, they take the time to listen to what you need, and there's some good expertise with those that fellow there with McCuney Oz up in Queensland. He's been very helpful. I've actually sorted out the low circuit and the high-speed circuit, and of course, as you know, if you've had experience with carburetors, the low and high are a mix of each other, especially during that changeover from low to high. So I'm quite glad that I have that sorted. And look, I'm not as physically capable as I once was, so I'd like to extend a big thank you to my younger son, Connor, who assisted with the manhandling and provision of youthful strength to undo, in particular, the output shaft retaining nut. There was some incredible force applied there to remove that. Thank you to my son once again. And yeah, thanks to everyone, and once again, all the best. Let me know what you think of this video. If you like, feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel. So here's that kit that I inferred earlier on. A whole heap of crush washers are there, and on eBay, just punch in crush washers and you get the whole lot. All this, a whole heap, for about 15 bucks. Okay, now just to finish up, what we're doing is we're in the process of, since we've got the new seals in there, it's important to put new oil in there and do an oil change. So this oil, usually when you're accessing the gearbox, is drained prior to removing the gearbox. That way, when you get to work on it and you tilt it in different directions, you haven't got oil spillage whatsoever because you've drained it. Now, if you can follow my pinky, you can just see it up in between the index finger, just there. I'm moving it. Well, about midpoint, just here, I've got my finger on the drain plug, and this here is the gearbox drain plug. Okay, now there's a little magnetic rod there, and what that is there for is to remove any metallic content, any fine sort of metal that's circulating in the gearbox, and collect it in one spot so as it doesn't continuously rinse around the teeth and mesh between gear cogs. So this is a remover or a collector by way of magnetism. Okay, that little center rod there. So I take the drain plug out and I just allow it to sit. You know, there's no rush. I'm doing other things in the process, and that way most of the oil content in that gearbox is removed. And simultaneously over here, the final drive, now I'll just show you about where my middle finger is, straight up underneath there, and that's it here. Now they're both the same size, okay, and they take from memory a 19 mil, so I usually use an extended long reach 19 mil socket with a 3/8 extended drive, and that gives me the clearance underneath the cradle of the frame. Now, most important on both occasions, our little crush washers. Don't use anything else, just use these crush washers. Don't go buying them out of exclusive places that specialize in BMW parts. Go online and you can buy a whole box for about $10 or $11. This nonsense of $2.98, $1.50, $2.50 for each washer is lining the pockets of someone else and helping them lead an elaborate lifestyle. So they can be sourced in bulk far more cheaper. Now I'm going to enter into that age-old political hot potato, oils. Castrol back in the day, oils ain't oils, sol. Some of you, 50s, late 50s and 60s vintage, would remember that ad broadcasted on telly. But look, they advocate, and I think it's very, very important that these boxes get a mineral oil, a petroleum, crude, refined mineral oil for specifically hypoid, HYPOID gearboxes with an EP, extreme pressure additive, because the mesh in here and the shear factor involved is horrific. It really needs to be a mineral-based EP extreme pressure oil for a hypoid box. I don't know if you've accessed Snowbum's scribblings or writings online, and he's not all that convinced about synthetics on these older type airhead boxes. Okay, so he advocates the 80W90 gear oil, mineral oil, EP extreme pressure for hypoid, HYPOID gearbox applications. He also advocates that for this, and also down the back there in the final drive, which of course is behind that hub that you can see there. Okay, now I've proceeded to fill the gearbox. I think you can just see the oil dripping out there. So you fill it up until it just starts to spill out of the filler plug. Of course, the bike is on the center stand. Now, it pretty well bypasses everything. It sort of drains past this cradle of the frame, and I just let it sit until it finds its own level. There's always something else in the shed to get on with. Like whilst I'm doing one job, I'm either painting parts or assembling other pieces for other bikes I have. And I usually have about 3 or 4 processes, 5 up to 7 processes happening at the same time. And that way I utilize the same time frame. I'm not waiting around for a part to dry. While it's drying in between coats, I come in and remove drain plugs and put new crush washers on, and then I come back to coat put another coat of paint on another part. So utilize your time wisely by incorporating 4 or 5 jobs at the same time. That's if you've got more bikes than one. But of course, over here there's another drain plug. Let me find that for you. There's the drain plug there. Get a bit of depth of field focus, and he has a new crush washer from that kit that I showed you earlier.